It is very wonderful to have as our presenter today one of the very elite choral conductors in the country, Dr. Anton Armstrong. Anton has since 1990 served as the Harry R. and Thora H. Tosdahl Chair in Music, a professor of music at St. Olaf College and conductor of the St. Olaf Choir. He is an outspoken advocate of music in the church, not only adult and youth choral music, but also for the inclusion and nurturing of children's choirs in the church. So, Anton, thanks for being with us today, and please teach us about our calling as church musicians.
Thanks, Jim, and it's good to be with all of you. I was part of one of the first national conferences when these several organizations decided to come together to do this event. So it's a joy to be back with you. I will say to some of you, you may have heard this talk in different formations. It keeps morphing. I'm reminded of a talk that the great Robert Shaw used to give, and it had the same title, but it seemed to morph. And this has been my inspiration for this talk. And as I've shared it with people who said they've heard it more than once, they seem to hear it with different ears, and especially for those who have heard it during this time of COVID. So I hope this gives us food for thought. It may be reinforcing in some ways or give you new ideas. This motto, body, mind, spirit, voice, actually is not my own. It is taken, was the mantra of the late Helen Kemp. Body, mind, spirit, voice, it takes the whole person to sing and rejoice. But as many of us called her Mama Helen, she would have never just said it. She would have sung it. Body, mind, spirit, voice, it takes the whole person to sing and rejoice. I first heard her share these thoughts at a seminar when she was on the faculty of Westminster Choir College. And in the summer of 1978, I received a call from the choir college. I was then running a summer coeducational summer music camp for the American Boy Choir School, and they needed some children for serve as a demonstration choir for Mama Helen at the choir college. And I went in to the Talbot Library, and they had a large lecture hall on the bottom of that. She had maybe 100, 125 people, and she was doing this, and they were moving around. I was all of about 22 at the time, about 40 pounds lighter and a lot more hair. And I thought to myself, this is the cheesiest, stupidest thing I've ever heard in my life. And I'm here to profess to you, it is the most salient bit of information that has stuck in my brain these last 40 some odd years. Because it was, in a nutshell, which was one of Helen's gifts, the ability to take a great idea and put it into a very small way of us understanding. That picture, I just want to say, was taken with my colleague John Ferguson now almost 6.5 years ago, and it happened about 10 days before she passed away. We were doing the final Augsburg Fortress Clinics, and it was at a wonderful church in Philadelphia. Helen had come with her daughter Kathy, and she was in the front row just singing her heart out. And afterwards, the four of us just spent time laughing and sharing stories. Until the sexton of the church said, folks, I'm glad you're having a good time, but my wife is holding dinner for me. Can you leave? And as we were leaving the church, I said to Kathy, 2.5 years, we're going to have a heck of a party. Well, Helen left us about 10 days later, but she lives on in the lives of so many of us. And if this is not a name you know, then look it up. Join Choristers Guild. You will find out a lot about Helen Kemp, but she's been a marvelous influence in my life. Now you're going to get the Lutheran side of me. And talking about vocation, our calling. So the idea of vocation in a nutshell is central to believe that each person is created with gifts and talents oriented towards specific purposes and a way of life. And what I want us to consider today and reconsider is how you see your vocare, your vocation, your calling to do this. For some of you, your life in church music, if you are a worship leader, may not be what you do to pay the bills every day. This may be a side part of your life's work. if you are active as a choir member or playing bells or playing other instruments in church or helping to lead and formulate worship, or I think there are several theologians on here, as you think about how music and the arts can be such a vibrant proclamation of God's message of love to the world. I want us to go back, and I'm thinking about the people we serve. And I'm using the term artist because if you can think of your folks as you have the ability to bring out something very special in them. I always love when I hear people say, well, are you singing in a choral group these days or whatever? And they just say, well, I just sing in just my church choir. Well, just my church choir is very important these days for all ages. And I want to share some points with you that have influenced my life, how music and art have enriched my life, but also helped to shape the person that I think I am today. And this may resonate with some of you, or you may certainly have other things that you could add to this list. But my list starts with these things. Our art forms our formational thoughts in our values and faith. And I really believe that through the arts and through music, for me especially, we develop a sense of individual value and worth. I was very fortunate. Yes, I'm a cradle Lutheran. Yes, there are African-American Lutherans, okay? And I was very fortunate to have wonderful worship leaders and music directors at my home church in Long Island, where I grew up. They were actually graduates of Westminster Choir College. We had a graded choir program back in the 1960s when that may not have been the thing to do in all places, but we had one there. I went to a parochial day school that our church sponsored, and usually most parochial day schools, especially in that area, were LCMS from the Missouri Synod, but we were at that time a Lutheran Church in America. So it was wonderful to have that education and a strong Sunday school background. But I have to tell you, it was in my making of music, starting off as a 6-year-old in our junior choir, that I most likely became more entrenched in understanding and forming my sense of faith. I know my scriptures because I've sung them, not just read about them or had to memorize them for catechism and confirmation classes. I sang those songs, and those songs are still deep in my heart. Our art form and our music builds community. And you all know that in different ways. And as we develop this individual value and personal worth in the context, we do so in a context of a group activity when we make music with other people. We also are teaching social skills. I often say this when I share this type of talk with, maybe public school music educators. And so often we are compared to music as being in a choir or an ensemble is compared to being in a sports team. Yeah, there are some similarities, there are some common threads, but here's a big difference. Unfortunately, the way sport is practiced these days, somebody has to be a winner, somebody has to be a loser. Just talk to the Georgia and Alabama fans from last weekend, okay? If you're football people. If we do our art, I think in the most wholesome and the healthiest ways, we are all winners. We are all winners. When I started doing this talk several years ago as a presentation for an award that I won from Baylor University, we were barely a decade into having the internet and digital. The iPhone was just about coming into being at that point. And I remember saying music carries emotional content. And some 15 years later, I'd say this is an even stronger point of view for me. Our art and our making of music especially helps develop us into expressive, compassionate, empathetic individuals, and hopefully just not simply musical robots. Long ago, someone said to me, music can set our hearts and minds on fire. And we express so often in song what we cannot say. This point about music carrying our emotions, especially as I deal with young people at the college level or even younger, is even more important. where do they get to express themselves? Where do they have meaningful relationships? Facebook friends, TikTok friends, Instagram friends? That's what, and especially in this era of COVID, when people have been so isolated. The joy of the last 5 or 6 months has been that many more of us could come back to worship together. We could have our choirs and not be, as I was with students and singers at St. Olaf, 9 feet apart, masked with half a group at a time and singing for no more than 30 minutes. I can tell you, working with young college students between 18 and 22 years of age, this has been important that they sing together, not just for an identity of being in a group, but that they can share each other, their trials, their tribulations, their joys. And I know this is not unique to the St. Olaf or Northfield communities. Once we could come together, my church was not able to worship together for nearly a year, more than a year. And when we could finally do that, just a sense of seeing people in the flesh, how amazing. But when you can share that, some of you may have seen this news already, and I'll just say it now. The St. Olaf Choir was to go on tour, leaving 2 weeks from today. And I say, yes, we were supposed to. But this past Tuesday, because of the rise of COVID on our campus and in the communities where we thought we had planned to travel, we had to cancel that trip. We're trying to see if we can put together a more modified tour later in the spring. That's yet to be determined. But as I was breaking this news to these singers and only being able to see their eyes because they were masked, and seeing the disappointment, and then seeing many tears, including my own and my manager's, as we shared this news, what was important for them was to sing before we left. They wanted to sing together. They needed to express that sense of disappointment, that sense of grief, but they needed music as a healing balm. Next, our art form, our music, transports our spirits. Whether in the classroom, the concert hall, worship space, or your own private settings, it lifts us up when we're down. Just recently, just a week ago, I had a chance to visit with a dear friend of mine who was a former First Lady of St. Olaf College, Lois Rand. And she is 96 years old, but 2 days before her 96th birthday in last August 1, she fell and broke her right hip. And she's been in a rehabilitation center just north of Northfield. And she is dealing with some onset of dementia. But we can talk about things in the memory, but what brought her so close to me 2 weeks ago was that I shared with her what I had done in terms of I was preparing to sing for Christmas Eve services. So this visit happened. I saw it last week. I did the same thing, but the first visit was December 23rd when I did this. And I told her what I was going to sing, and she knew the piece. And I started singing it, and she was mouthing the words. And then I said, well, let's sing together. So we sang Silent Night. We sang Beautiful Savior. The next day, when her son, who visits her every day, came to see her, she was so clear about that visit. And he said, thank you, because it's lifted my mother's life and gave her a joy that I haven't seen for her in a long time. Music can motivate, and we know that. It becomes a dynamic catalyst in areas of informing and encouraging action on our moral beliefs and social actions. We have seen this. Those of you who are old enough, who lived through the civil rights era of the 60s and 50s, 60s, and 70s, you know that singing was a huge part, or those of you who remember seeing the footage coming out of South Africa during the time of apartheid. And some of these songs now have made their ways into our worship lives through hymnals, these freedom songs from South Africa. But these were the songs that sustained people as they fought against oppression in their country. It gives us strength and courage. I talked to a friend of mine who traveled with students from St. Olaf in the 1960s as freedom riders. And they talked about, yes, before they could hear dogs barking outside of the building, they knew they were being yelled at over bullhorns and the like, and they knew that when they walked out there, they were putting their lives into the way of physical harm. And yes, they prayed for God's help and guidance, but what gave them strength is that they left those places facing angry people. They sang. They sang, "We Shall Overcome." They sang some of the great African American spirituals. They sang those songs of courage and hope. So music is a strong motivator. In this world and in our church, our art forms also are vehicles for cross-cultural and interdisciplinary learning. And yes, I was taught a lot in my junior choir about different worlds and different cultures outside of my own. The day school, the parochial day school I went to, our school hymn was "Children of the Heavenly Father." But I didn't know I was being multicultural as a kindergartner when they taught me the first verse in Swedish. I didn't realize it was Swedish. I just knew it was, that's how you sang that song, you know? And I thought for years, was, and "Children of the Heavenly Father" was actually the second verse. I had to learn how things went. But as a child, you know, that old song from South Pacific, you have to be taught to hate and fear. Well, I was taught to love and cherish as a child in my home and in my church and in that junior choir. But for some of you who come from very homogeneous communities and people don't look that different from you, what we share in our worship can be a wonderful way of understanding God's love for all of God's children. And if you are fortunate to be in more diverse communities, to lift up the song of all people's cultures, to know that in God there is no east or west, him no south or north, but one great fellowship of love. And that we can teach through our music making and how we worship together. I'm afraid, and this has become even more true in the last 15 years or so, our music making, whether it was with choirs, handbells, instruments, becomes maybe one of the last living models and experiences for excellence. We have dumbed down in so many ways in our lives, in civil behavior to one another, and expecting and taking the least common denominator of civility and not expecting the best. And I think this, I hate the word authentic. Tell me, when you put me in the ground, how authentic have I been? But what I ask young people to do, I've even asked them to stop being adults, because adults are not always mature human beings. But can they be the best versions of themselves? Can they seek to be the best version of what they can be? And in our music making, we teach an interesting life lesson, because you're not going to get all the notes right that first time singing through an anthem, or playing in your handbell choir, or in that church orchestra or band. You're not going to get it right, and you have to persevere. And it's fine to not get everything right the first time. We haven't failed. It's just that we have to keep striving to be better. But in a world in which having technology and getting an instant answer out of Google or Siri or whatever it is, our young people and people beyond the age of 18 don't have the patience, don't have the understanding of listening to one another. Our art form still is so dependent on people having to listen to one another and to put aside their own narrow perspective and widen their view. I can tell you, with the students that I work with at St. Olaf, I see this as I go around the country. I can put people of such diverse political views sometimes, but the one thing when they get in a choir, those things become less important, and they find a common goal to sing and make something beautiful. It's one of the last platforms where people actually will listen to one another and to share with one another, and provides that living model for excellence in all ways. And finally, our art form brings healing. This art form that is so important in giving comfort, giving hope, giving strength to people of all ages. If you've heard this talk before, then you've heard me share my own personal story in this way. My own dear mother had dementia in the final years of her life. And my last visit with her was about December 28th or 29th of 2006. And I'd been arguing with her physicians that they were just over-medicating her. She was in a care center the last 2 years of her life. And we were just getting that altered. But I had had a good visit. I'd returned to New York where she was living. And she had been pretty aware of things, even more communicative than she had been more recently. But that last day I went in early in the morning, wanted to see how she was going to be all day. And I planned to spend that whole day with her. And I got to her and they had her dressed and she was in the community room, but she didn't even recognize me. I spoke to her and there was no communication back. It was like this veil. And after about 40 minutes, I decided to take her back to her own room, which I did. My brother kept a boombox next to her bed with CD recordings and several of them of the St. Olaf Choir. And I popped in one of the great Hymns of Faith albums that we had created at the time. And she was fine, but we got to the Chris Johnson Beautiful Savior, the piece that many of you know as sort of the theme piece for the St. Olaf Choir. She finally uttered some words. She didn't look at me. She said, "I know that. I really know that." My mother was a real contralto. Excuse me, but she wasn't just a mezzo. She was a real contralto, but she was never she had never had a lot of training in her life. But one of the few pieces that she ever sang with the church choir as a soloist, she sang that Beautiful Savior solo. So when we got to that solo verse, she sang it. And then she sang that third verse and her second alto part. She even sings a part that my predecessor and I have cut out, but she sang that part. And whatever was next, she kind of got agitated. I turned it off. But her favorite gospel hymn was His Eyes on the Sparrow. And I sing because I'm happy. I sing because I'm free. His eyes on the sparrow, and I know he watches me. Now, I got through the whole first verse, didn't fault words, sang the chorus again, got to the second verse, started off, could not remember the rest of the words. My dear mother remembered all the words, got me back to the refrain. And when we were done with that, my friends, she looked up at me. I had been there now almost 75 minutes with her, but she looked up at me and she said, "Baby, how long you been here? You look good. Somebody's feeding you really good these days, aren't they?" I said. But when medicine and science couldn't give my mother back to me, that shared gift of song. And for the rest of the day, she was my mom. She knew me. If you've never had that experience, I hope it comes for you sometime. Ruth Trabel Jacobs was a wonderful musician, church musician, strong Mennonite who was the founder of Choristers Guild. And she was a very wise woman. Years ago, she wrote in one of her books, "I believe that our emphasis must be on the person, not the subject. Great music has no value in itself, only when it penetrates the personality and has its influence there does it really live." And for me, that was so revealing. Yes, I'm a trained musician with, 3 degrees in music. Yes, I can analyze a score and I can appreciate the intellectual craft and composition that goes into it. And if you're one of those people who loves to do score analysis, especially, one of my favorite forms to examine is fugue. I love that there's a subject and a counter subject and exposition of those ideas, and then you fool around with those ideas and you see it in retrograde and inversion and stretto, and then it comes back again. My brain can get off on that to a certain degree. But that piece means nothing until I hear it in the voices or hear it in the hands of instrumentalists. That's when the music comes alive, because it's coming out of somebody else's sense of creativity. Years ago, my dear friend and longtime colleague, John Ferguson, shared in a lecture he was giving, the whole concept that our vocation, as our calling as musicians and as pastoral musicians, is countercultural. He said those words in this lecture over 20 years ago, but just because something is said a bunch of years ago doesn't mean that it doesn't have relevance today. And what John said is that our culture of constant entertainment suggests that it is better to sit back and let others sing for us. Our contemporary culture frowns upon group song, but deep within us, way down deep in our very being, there is still something we can't ignore, something we can't articulate, something we still feel, something which calls us to song. We can't help it. We were made that way. And again, I think back at times of stress and crisis in the world and in my own life. I go back to thinking about 9/11. And within a day or so after that event, when members of Congress gathered in the steps of the Capitol, much unlike January 6th of last year, but when they gathered together, and there was strong, Jesse Helms and Teddy Kennedy standing next to each other, singing America the Beautiful, singing My Country 'Tis of Thee. I don't remember the words that Reverend Graham or President Bush uttered at the National Cathedral, but I remember Denise Graves singing Amazing Grace. I remember what solace that gave me, especially as a New Yorker who grew up seeing those Twin Towers built as a junior high school student, visiting those on field trips, and then traveling to New York soon after that event, as soon as I could get in the air to make sure that my parents were safe, because they lived about 40 minutes from Lower Manhattan, and to see those buildings just in ruin and still smoldering in the ash. But I remember how music was a healing balm. The other thing that I really hope that we can think about, my friends, and that's a quote I just gave you of Ruth Trabel Jacobs, that we are developing whole people. And not just, I learned this idea of, when I talk about a choir, my good colleagues and friends, Paul Westermeyer and John Ferguson, always talk about the big choir and the small choir. And for them, the big choir is the assembly, the congregation. If they're not singing correctly, I don't care how well your Wednesday night or Sunday morning choir sings, we've not done our job fully. We need to engage that entire assembly of people, understanding that they have a voice to lift up and praise. They have a voice that can enjoy this. We maybe can spend more focused time when we are in our senior choirs or adult choirs or youth choirs or handbell choirs, whatever. But we need to raise up that whole group of people who come into our midst to worship. And in that way, music is relational and transforming. Our arts, my friends, our music making must be in service to others. It calls us to be humble and vulnerable in the sharing of our gifts. I often think with my students, ask them to think about the inspirational role models, especially my music students or my conducting classes. Why are you doing this? If somebody told you you're going to get rich out of this business, they were lying to you. So that's not the reason you do this, okay? But who have been the inspirational role models in your life who have helped to shape you in the path you've chosen as a music and an arts educator? Who are those who have motivated you through nurturing discipline and affirmation, not fear and intimidation? Again, I go back to the wisdom of Helen Kemp. She often would say, we are imprinting musical memories for the soul in a lifetime. For in this high-tech world, the music we sing with children, in fact, with all people, makes us responsible for what we put into their hearts, minds, and souls. If any of you did know Helen, you know that in her last year, she moved out of her family home in Bucks County into a wonderful senior living community that she chose, not her children, she chose. And she decided they needed a choir there. And I've been telling Mama Helen for years, there are so many things that I've learned from you that I use with, all state choirs. I use the St. Olaf Choir. And I remember her on a call when they say, dear, you're right. It really works with them. She wanted to give people of all ages the joy of knowing what it meant to sing and to lift their voices and being community, especially so many times with older people who can be so isolated. And for any of you who have been trying to work in the last 2 years with COVID, we have lived in isolation. But Helen often would quote these words from the TV journalist Tom Brokaw. It is not enough to wire the world if you short circuit the soul. It is not enough to wire the world if you short circuit the soul. I first heard those words out of her in a presentation she gave 23 years ago. And it's even more true today. Our technology. I had to get a new iPhone yesterday because my i7, which is still working really fine, they're telling me in a week, because of 5G, will be not functional. So they made me go and get a new phone. Yeah, I can upgrade my technology, but that new technology and all that is not dealing with COVID. It's not helping me to have to give a healing balm to students who I've just had to disappoint that we can't go on a tour to share their music. So we can have all this wonderful technology, but can we figure out a way to still give people of all ages a healing balm? And we have the medicine as pastoral leaders, as church musicians, as worship leaders, as preachers. We have a medicine much better than science to do that. For some of you who may have heard this talk up to this point, this is new. You haven't heard this because this is something I've had to work with. And as you deal in your worshiping communities, if some of you are also teachers outside of the worshiping communities, there are challenges that we're facing that I didn't face 20 years ago, or even 10 years ago, or even 5 years ago, not in the level I'm facing now. And that I see my other colleagues, as I talk with people across the nation, and I bring this point up, I just see a lot of nodding of heads. First of all, we're coping with students and families in an age of entitlement. As we deal with those of you who are dealing with parents, whether it's in the worshiping community or maybe as community leaders in music or certainly in our churches, we deal with helicopter and snowplow parents who want to avoid failure for their children at all costs. Helicopter parents I kind of knew about until a couple of years ago when I encountered snowplow parents. Snowplow parents are the ones, helicopter, they're always hovering over the kids, right? But the snowplow parents are the ones who come in, whether their kid is right or wrong, they clear the way of all obstacles so the child will not fail. Now you can say I was raised by old-fashioned parents, but we were taught certain things. There's a saying that I ask my students to repeat when they really irritate me before I'm about to blow my gasket. And it's something my mother would say to me. Now I have two older brothers, one's 10 years older and one is 14 years older. They claim they don't remember being told this. And maybe because they said you were so spoiled. But mother would say, when I would really exasperate her, she would just simply look at me, she said, boy, we have brains in this family, will you please use them? And then she would make me repeat the following. Ignorance is the absence of knowledge. Would you all say that with me? You stay unmuted. I can read some of your lips. Ignorance is the absence of knowledge. Go ahead. Second part of this is stupidity is having knowledge. Say that with me. Stupidity is having knowledge and choosing not to use it. And choosing not to use it. Stupidity is having knowledge and choosing not to use it. And then she'd look at me square in the face and she'd say, and you are too intelligent to be that stupid. Whomp on the back of the head. Now, I can't do whomp. My insurance doesn't cover me for that, okay? But we're dealing with this. We're dealing with this in so many ways. And the nature of COVID has even focus, the lens, we have turned so inwardly, and our concerns become the most important. When we were allowed to come back in more full relationships with people this past fall, even though we were dealing with Delta, I could come back with a whole choir. Yes, still maybe masked, slightly socially distanced, but we could make music together. And so many things that had been denied us through 2020 in the early part of 21, I thought our students would come back with more gratitude. To some degree they have, and we have great students at St. Olaf. But again, I'm seeing this as I talk to friends and families. We have we must continue to nurture empathy, compassion, and gratitude in not just our young people, but in all people of all ages. Because that's the one thing that our music making teaches: patience, perseverance, and dedication. Living in the academy, I'm surrounded by incredible intellectual intelligence. However, sometimes emotional intelligence evades my reality. Emotional intelligence being common sense. And it's not just in the academy. I see it in the church. I see it certainly in politics. I see it in the way we are dealing just with the issues of trying to protect each other, vaccinated or not vaccinated, this or that. Also in the last 5 to 6 years, especially with the growth of the Me Too movement, which is needed and was needed and is needed, speaking truth to power is important as we strive for diversity, equity, and inclusion. But we must be careful it doesn't become a selfish and self-serving. And I've seen that twist to this, that all of a sudden, again, you forget what is the need for the good of the whole. The great commandment, love thy neighbor. We end up loving ourselves more than loving our neighbor. And for those of us who have worked maybe all of our lives, but now it's on the front burner, working for access, diversity, equity, inclusion. We need to create communities of belonging. I've stopped using the term welcoming because that implies somebody belongs in and somebody's outside of it. But in wherever you are, and it's not just about race or gender, it could be about orientation, about those who have different disabilities and areas of their lives that we need to acknowledge our reality for some folks and not being able to do everything that somebody else can do. And can we create communities where everyone can find a place of belonging? But as I say that, nurturing also respect for tradition and finding the best of tradition while being visionary prophetic voices. I say that to us as musicians because I deal with young people who, especially as we want to strive for greater inclusion and diversity, lifting up marginalized voices of women and people of color as composers and music to be done. The next thing I hear out of their young, dear lives, I'm sick and tired of doing all this music by dead white men. Well, a lot of us wouldn't be in this business with those music of those dead white men. But are there other voices that need to be heard? Yes. So I'm a middle ground person. I've never been to the far left or the far right. I live in a well-defined gray, okay? And what I'm asking as part of that relation is that we find that way that we can, our art form, our music making, our congregational singing, they're bridges. They're the bridges. So nurturing and understanding, I sometimes have to remind young people, you haven't created this, the world doesn't start new, or we hire a new person and all of a sudden they want to just throw out the baby with the bathwater. No, but let's clean out the dirty water, keep the baby. So I'm coming close to the end of this talk. What is my charge to myself? And this week, as I've had to disappoint a bunch of these students, I'm thinking about this heavy. But how do I become, and how do I strive to be a better servant leader who can create art, music to enrich and inspire others, and ourselves for lives of worth and service? And also using our music making, our art, as a means of nurturing and nourishing whole people, body, mind, spirit, voice. It takes the whole person to sing and rejoice. And breaking down the walls within and outside of us. The thing about COVID, it has forced us, whether we want it or not, to turn inwards. What do I need to just survive? You know, literally, I tested positive for COVID. I was totally asymptomatic. I had both vaccines and I had just been boosted 3 weeks before that. And when did it come? Literally 4 days before my first St. Olaf Christmas Festival concert. I wasn't able to conduct that. I was fortunate to be able to turn some of my work over to several of my colleagues, and then a former student and dear friend, Mark Stover, flew in and conducted the St. Olaf Choir for that. But I tell you, being quarantined, and I'm a single man, being quarantined for 10 days by yourself makes it really get freaky in your thinking sometimes, you know? And I put my own walls upon myself. And yet all the walls that society wants to place. I'm doing a piece right now with St. Olaf Choir. It's a setting of 3 American hymns by Alice Parker, Come Ye That Love the Lord. And I love the second verse. I sang that as a student. I haven't performed it in 30 some odd years. But I thought this was the year, one, to honor Alice, as she's still with us and vital at age 96. But I love the text by Isaac Watts. I especially love the second verse to share with young people, sometimes who are on their own journeys, that there is not a God, or religion is crappy, or whatever. Because that second verse of Isaac Watts, religion never was designed to make our pleasures less. I love that. And I've asked them about that. And some of them who I know can be very cynical. And they said, well, you know, it made us think a little bit differently about religion. Or I said, how do you think about God? The piece I want to share with you right now is a work that is published by Choristers Guild. Mark Miller is the composer. He's a wonderful African-American church musician, and I believe teaches at Drew University. The text is, love has broken down the walls. And so just in case some people are talking about, we're not talking about the walls at our southern borders, folks. This is not what this song is about. It's about the walls that we build around ourselves and that society builds around us. But it's love. Love is the essence of what it is going to take. I'm going to share this recording. I hope you can all hear it. One of the great opportunities I've had in my life is to be part of the Oregon Bach Festival for now almost 24 years. And I helped to start a high school program in 1998. And this was our last summer together in 2019. Young people come throughout the nation to be part of this for 10 days. And I hope we can do this in 22 again, finally. Can you hear that? We are accepted as we are. I'm at a point in my life of understanding three basic concepts for us to move ahead in the world, but certainly as we practice things in our worshiping communities, we need several things. First of all, we need respect. We have forgotten in this world how to respect one another, even if we differ. How do you do so? I remember as a young man hearing political differences among politicians. Remember Jerry Ford and Jimmy Carter. But they would always refer as my respected opponent. They always showed decency to one another. That has ceased to be a model for us in our political life. I don't care what side of the aisle you find yourself on, we've just stopped being respectful. And without respect as a foundation, we can't move forward. But if we can establish that, and I believe our choirs, our music ensembles are ways we can find respect, because we center something more important than our selfish ideals. We find something more common. And out of that sense of respect, maybe trust can start to develop. Because we stop trusting one another. We stop trusting in the common good. And I still see this as ways that we do this in our communities. And finally, and you may call me still a little bit Pollyannish in this, but when there's true respect and when trust can start to emerge, then the possibility of the love, where we accept each other as we are. And we ask us to be better. Helen Kemp offered these words for a master teacher. And she saw people, you didn't have to have a degree in teaching to be a teacher. Parents are teachers to their children. Those of us who are active in worship life, we are teachers. There's a wonderful woman who was one of the first ordained women in the LCA, which became part of the ELCA. But Barbara Hosmer was a member of my home congregation, and her son later came to St. Olave's, and she was at my home following a Christmas festival, and she said, I had a lot of teachers, but your mother was among the most influential. I said, my mother? I don't remember my mother ever teaching confirmation class or Sunday school. She said, oh, no. But you remember in our church, we used to have a bowling alley in our church at one point. That's where the kids did a lot of things. And a bunch of my peers and I were running through the basement. And all of a sudden, this booming voice called out, Barbara Hosmer, you don't run in the house of God. She turned and she said, it was your mother. And she said, but Mrs. Armstrong, we're in the bowling alley. Still part of the house of God, don't you run. And if you don't believe I'll tell your mother, I will. You know better than that. I said, were you scared? She said, your mother meant business. But one of the other things I knew is that your mother cared about me and I wasn't her own child. That's the sort of environment I grew up in. Neighbors looked after us. And if we acted up outside, those neighbors told our parents, and we were constantly learning from each other. So Mama Helen, while she may have been talking initially to music educators and worship leaders, she said, a master teacher has these qualities. They ignite the spirit. They enrich the mind, and they empower positive action. Yes, I'm in the field of teaching, but we all are. Whether you have a child or not, you influence people. And can you think that the work that you do in your places of worship, or in your schools, or in your community organizations, or in your job, whatever that may be, is the work that you're doing helping to ignite not only your spirit, but the spirit of people around you? And what you are sharing through your music making, through your preaching, through your artistic endeavors, does it enrich the mind? Give people a reason to want to show up on a Sunday morning? And will it empower positive action? One of the things that I have, and then I'll be ready to answer your questions, my dear friends, but was words of Nelson Mandela that have stuck with me for many, many years. And he writes, "Our deepest fear is not that we are inadequate. Our deepest fear is that we are powerful beyond measure. It is our light, not our darkness, that most frightens us. We ask ourselves, who am I to be brilliant, gorgeous, talented, and fabulous? Actually, who are you not to be? You are a child of God. Your playing small doesn't serve the world. There is nothing enlightened about shrinking so that other people won't feel insecure around you. We were born to make manifest the glory of God within us. It is not just in some of us, it is in everyone. And as we let our own light shine, we unconsciously give other people permission to do the same. We are agents of light and hope." Jim said we have time for questions and answers. You have questions. I will hope that my responses, I don't know if I always have answers, but I'll try to have responses for you. So Jim, let's get to those.
Thank you very much, Anton, for this wonderful inspiration and motivation. What you have actually done has been to inspire many of our registrants today to also include some inspirational messages in the chat box. If there are questions or other comments, please include those. I was wondering, Anton, if you have any suggestions, practical thoughts for those of us leading music in churches related to doing so during a pandemic.
Oh, Lord. Technology is not always my friend. I've been forced to learn how to lead people in singing across. It's not been easy. And I have to have partners who are technologically more informed and possible. I think what is possible, you know, the virtual choirs look great, but you either have to be the one or you have to have somebody who has that knowledge to lead together, to actually put those things together. And it can be so intimidating. We have done a couple of those early when the pandemic hit in the spring of 2020. The St. Louis Choir did one, A Beautiful Savior, and then they surprised me with a piece that Andre Thomas had written, honoring my 30th year at St. Olaf. I would say the important thing for those of you who are in warmer climates, you can actually gather outside, do that. You can be masked, you can be outside, okay? We found out during the height of the first round of the pandemic and even through the Delta variant, that if we were masked and we kept social distance, we could do this. You could do the singing. You have to be properly masked. I would encourage as many of you that can do that, and even if you have to be distanced, people need to be with, we're social creatures, and to be forced apart is just unnatural, and it is demoralizing. Short of that, when you can gather, and if you have somebody who has a technological prowess that I certainly know I don't, and many of my musician friends don't, but to put together an opportunity to sing together, it's intimidating because you start hearing your own voice, you get a reality check that maybe you don't want to have. But you know, that's not the important thing. It's that you use your voice and collectively we can come together to do something rather than just sitting home and not singing it at all. And even with this heightened Omicron at this point, maybe we have to take a little bit of hiatus, but I don't think that we have to go away as we did in the first round, not singing for 5, 6, 7 months at a time. I think in that case, then you do use such things as Zoom or FaceTime to at least create community where you all can share with one another. And maybe it's somebody singing for the group. If organized group singing is not the easiest thing for you to facilitate with the extent of the technology at hand in your own situation. But I think it's important that people come together. So often during this, if we didn't sing as a choir, I met with the St. Louis Choir so we could talk. They just needed sometimes to see a familiar face and to share how they were feeling and to find out they were not the only ones feeling like that. We need our communities.
Good. That's a good answer. We have an interesting question from Alice Caldwell. She says, any thoughts about how to counter the all-encompassing race toward college admissions, where participation in church/church music doesn't count for much in many families?
Alice, if you can unmute yourself, because I need you to help me clarify a little bit. So if you can unmute yourself. So are you saying that as young people are applying that extracurricular activities such as church or being active doesn't seem to count as part of that? Is that what you're talking about?
Yes, that's exactly what I mean. That's very pronounced in our community. There's a kind of select list of what counts toward setting up the best possible portfolio for college admissions, and church doesn't make that list very often.
Well, I have two answers. One may sound a little bit self-serving, but I'll be real direct. Part of it is, I think, in the student's letter of application, I think they may have to make a case for why this is. And they have to show the values and the virtues of doing this type of activity and how that has contributed to the growth of that student, okay? And I think just putting it down on a list, you may be right, may not, but I think sometimes, especially with the younger generation of admissions people, they need to understand that value because they may not understand it intrinsically themselves. So I think we have to be more intentional about saying, what have I learned from participating in church? And maybe not so much addressing the faith aspect, though that's important in many ways, but what have you learned about being a social creature? What has being part of a church community that maybe has done volunteer work in the community, or as you've reached out to work with those who have hunger insecurity or don't have a place to sleep at night, and how maybe the work that you've done in that way, if you can point to some of those things, or even as a choir, if you've gone into a shelter to sing and share music, or into a prison, or into some other way that you're showing social and civic engagement. That's the terminology that's being used by a lot of colleges these days. They want to see civic engagements. And so I would encourage you that. The other side, this is the one part that sounds a little more self-serving. Maybe they're looking at the wrong colleges. Maybe they need to look at the colleges that will. I will tell you, St. Olaf College will value that. And we're not the only ones. But to maybe look at a type of college, because that kind of tells you a little bit about maybe the education you're going to get. It may be highly intellectual, but I would hope that, and one of the challenges I say to any student looking at us, how will you be a different person after 4 years? And what kind of person do you want to be after 4 years? That's the nurturing of the whole person. I've just finished an article or chapter for a book that the ELCA will be publishing for people teaching at ELCA colleges. And part of it was on the importance of music as a force, as a tangible element of vocation, of helping young people to understand their calling and how it transforms lives. And I would say that that's the type of school you want to look to. They all are not necessarily have to be religious, but I think to look at a school that will not only offer a high and rigorous intellectual training, but how will it shape and broaden the heart and soul of a young person. Does that help in any way?
Yes, thank you. I guess my larger issue is doesn't affect the children and their families who are currently involved in our programs. They get it. It's how to reach out to the community to say, we have good things to offer your children. We nurture your families in our church community and with our programs. That's where I find a gap.
Yeah, and I think here, I would simply say to you in this way, this is when it's going to be one-to-one, and I'm not putting it on you. It's the people who are involved already in your community, for them to help be the feet on the ground, to get to friends who might have a sense of, maybe they're friends who are not churched, and maybe they don't want a lot of church. They just want to be in an environment. Most parents want their kids to be in a healthy, safe environment, right? And if you're offering activities as part of being in your youth groups or certainly in your choirs. That's again where we're not used to having to do it, but I think we have to be better sales agents. I mean, that's a kind of 21st cop out for calling evangelism, because you're sharing the good word of the gospel as a good and a good evangelist. But at this point, you maybe need to give them concrete ways in which your program is serving them beyond music. That was my point in that list of how do we nurture the whole person. And I think if you go through a lot of that list, you will see there are so many ways that through the music, we shape people. We shape people of all ages. And that you may need to now start selling as a point within the church and helping those, not just the kids, but the parents of them to say, you need to come and experience and to give them up, bring a friend to choir. Bring a friend to choir. You don't have to be religious. Just come and sing. Come and be part of the group. And that has been one way, a more effective way than me putting up posters and doing this, but getting those kids out and maybe getting the youth, but even your adults, doing something else other than just, I know in their busy lives, but just singing at a worship service. Maybe they're part of another event in the congregation, or maybe they're part of some event in the community. And people can start to see you, and not just see you, well, you're those Lutherans, you're those Episcopalians or Methodists or whatever, but you're contributing to the community in a way. And show yourself, that's one way of showing your own light. But I think what has to be is you're gonna have to be very, you and I and others in this thing, I'm having to be more intentional of saying, this is what we have to offer. Because people are out there shopping and they have to know why they should shop at your place.
Thank you.
Yeah. Other questions?
Well, Anton, this has been very wonderful. I appreciate all of your inspiration today, and also the wonderful and inspirational comments that registrants have included in the chat box. And Anton, I also want to say I have always so appreciated that as the Synod of Choir Director, you have prioritized so much time to be supportive and helpful and encouraging to those of us who are making music in the church. So thank you for that. And this is another example of that. So thanks for being with us.
Thank you. If I can
today.
simply say this in response to that, thank you. But I also was taught by my parents and by wonderful congregation I came out of, the Lutheran Church of the Epiphany on Long Island. Your life needs to always be paying back. I've been very fortunate. My parents didn't have a lot of means, but they always taught us, Mother from the beginning, write thank you notes, which I wish I could still be better as an adult, but give back to others. And that's what I think we're all called to do in our work. And so thank you for that acknowledgement, but that's just kind of paying it forward, and people lifted me up, and that's what I'm trying to do. And for all you good people out there, I'll use a bad word, this is a hell of a time to have to be a musician, especially a choir director or anybody who has to deal with winds and breath. But I'm going to quote, "Fürchte dich nicht," be not afraid, I am with thee. And God doesn't, this past week, I'll tell you, my faith got tested. I had to stand in front of those kids and tell them a lot of things. But I don't believe God has failed me. I have to figure out other ways of doing things, helping kids to see in a world in which so many things are turned off. I have to constantly remind them of what I think should be obvious, but it isn't. And sometimes I know I sound like a broken record to them, but fine, maybe they'll hear it. I just wish all of you blessings as we face this, and that don't give up hope and don't give up faith.
Thank you, Anton. And thanks to your parents. You had a wonderful set of parents, I can tell as well. Everyone, please be watching our ALCM website for information about coming webinars in 2022. It would be wonderful to have you join us for webinars that will be coming soon. I am going to see if I can share on the screen something for you. Bear with me here just a moment. See if I'm able to to this. Luckily, you're all very patient. All right, well, you should now see a little promo piece for the ALCM conference that is happening this summer. And I hope that you will consider registering for this conference. The early bird discount ends tomorrow. So now is the time to register. The Leipzig, Germany Choral Ensemble, Kelmis, will be with us. The U.S. Ensemble Cantus will be with us, as well as organist Martin Jean and the Lutheran Summer Music students and faculty. Information is at alcm.org under From Generation to Generation. And did I mention that tomorrow is the last day for the big registration discount? I hope you'll take a look at that. So thank you, everyone, ALCM members and National Conference for Sacred Music attendees alike. It's been wonderful to have both groups together today. Thank you to Jessica Bircher from the Morningstar Music Publishers staff for all of her technical assistance. And thanks again, Anton, and blessings to everyone. I hope you'll be with us again for our next webinar. Thank you, everyone. Take care. It is very